today with the folks from Coupa. I will be just kicking things off. I'm going to the live feed right now, so just give me a couple of seconds and then we will get started. Just want to make sure we're live on Twitter and on LinkedIn Live as well to make sure that everybody can see us and that we can monitor all the different rooms and things like that. So if you just bear with me 1 second, I just have to refresh my LinkedIn screen to make sure we are on LinkedIn Live. Looks like we are. Tina, can you confirm that we are on LinkedIn Live?
Not just yet. I'm just waiting for it to pop up.
All right. Should be coming up any second.
Yep, you're here.
Yes, we are.
All set.
Fantastic. All right. All right. So hello, everybody. Welcome to Procurement Foundry again. We are having our next webinar associated with risk and supply chain. This is risk in supply chain cost optimization and risk management month. As you all know, we're leading up to our August 5th next Forge event, which is called Dollars and Cents. Yes, I did come up with that name and I am trademarking it. It's all about cost optimization and risk management. And today we are joined by two amazingly brilliant folks from Coupa to talk about third-party supplier risk, third-party and supplier risk, I apologize, associated with technologies in that space. We're going to talk about best practices. We're going to talk about what's happening in that space. We're going to talk about people who are just starting, people who are very mature in that space. So super excited about that. And as usual, just a little bit of housekeeping. We do have the chat open inside of our Zoom room. As always, we have a live studio audience inside of Zoom, and we are broadcasting live on LinkedIn Live. So if you are on LinkedIn Live, you can put your questions in the comments on LinkedIn Live. Here inside of the Zoom room, if you would like, feel free to use the chat, say hello to everybody, tell us where you're from. Please use the Q&A at the bottom of the page inside of your Zoom room to ask questions. We do not like to hold questions to the end. We love to incorporate them as we go. I will be attempting to juggle plates and watch the Q&A and hold the conversation and keep an eye on LinkedIn at the same time. That said, I would love to make some introductions to Sam and Allison. Thank you so much to Sam Mele. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. Is that correct, Sam? Is Mele?
Mele.
Mele.
You've got it right. That's actually, you pronounced it properly, Michael, if we were still in Italy. You know,
yeah.
Here in the States, we'll just go with the long E's. Keep it simple.
That's nice. You should see how they butcher my name. Yeah, unless I'm in Paris, nobody says the right way. So, and also Allison Berry. Allison, thank you so much for being with us today as well.
Pleasure. My pleasure.
Great.
Thank you.
So now that the housekeeping's out of the way and now that we're live and we're streaming, let's dive into this. So tell me a little bit. I don't like to make introductions. I love to hear people tell their own story. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your position, a little bit about what you do, what your responsibilities are, that would be great to kind of set the backdrop for this. So why don't we go with ladies first? Allison, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for Coupa, that would be great. And we'd love to hear it.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Yes, I've been at Coupa about 3 years. I manage a team of product specialists, so we work with our customers and prospective customers, understand business requirements and match up our software capabilities. And I've been in that kind of role my entire career, either in supply management, with the last 12 years really focusing on supplier risk management. So Sam will have a similar background because we've been at similar companies over the years. So it's very interesting to be here with the convergence really of supplier risk management into business spend management. So, so that's a little bit about my role. And
thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sam?
Yeah, hello, everyone. Sam Mele, and like Allison, I've been with Coupa for about 3 years as well. I've been in what I would consider to be the third-party risk management space for about the last 10. For the better part of 30 years or so, I've been involved in the software industry in various capacities. I think I bring a healthy mix of supply chain management and risk management, performance management, and spend management to the table. So we can talk about, as Allison mentioned, kind of this convergence of how spend management, where procurement and downstream processes and upstream processes are starting to leverage information from third-party risk initiatives. More specifically at Coupa, I'm really involved in our pursuits of new opportunities, whether they be in Asia, North America, or Europe, and also assisting existing clients in their challenges to continue their third-party management programs and meet their objectives.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting as you describe it as a convergence. I kind of see it that way. I know I've been a long time procurement person, as you know, from our walkthrough. I've been doing this a couple of decades, and the risk team was always kind of down the hall, right? It was like, okay, those people, they're almost as goofy as we are. I've heard their conferences are almost as boring as our conferences, right? But now there's just, I mean, it's just everywhere. It's one of the leading conversations inside of Procurement Foundry associated with risk. And there's a ton of different, I got to be honest with you, we did the walkthrough on this, and my education went up about 3,000%. And I felt like an infant in this space because of how much I learned just in the pre-conversation with you all about risk and the exposure of risk and the amount of risk that's out there, and the different types of risk as well. So can you tell me a little bit about Coupa? How does Coupa engage? What's the strategy? What's the roadmap for engaging in this arena? Because it's evolving quickly, and like you said, it's converging quickly. All of a sudden now, procurement people, strategic sourcing people, CPOs need to be pseudo risk experts, and we are not. I'm just going to throw that out there on the table. Allison, why don't you go first? Tell us just a little bit about how Coupa is aligning in that arena before we jump into all the other stuff we've got.
Sure. I think, there's multiple aspects of it, right? So I always kind of think of there's the whole supplier and third-party assessment process, right? But those risk teams that do that, and they often have to work with procurement and sourcing. So when you're initially going out to bid, and you got to vet all your potential suppliers and do all that due diligence, and then they have all this documentation they collect, and it sits in a SharePoint drive, and then that's it, right? And then they go off and they buy and they do stuff, and they continue to work, and maybe they on a spreadsheet track performance, and they do their best to make sure they don't, the supplier's not going bankrupt or anything. And there's really kind of very little connection into the ongoing relationship and procurement for that supplier. And I always think of that around the monitoring portion, right? So I think from our perspective, that's a key aspect, right? So it's not just a one-time thing at the beginning where you assess, okay, is this supplier going to be able to deliver this good or service, but are they going to be there in 6 months? And I think that the pandemic really shined a bright light on that, right? So all the changes and disruptions and supply and just companies, going out of business or not being able to get with materials and things. So again, it's that having that immediate tie into everything you do with the supplier and how you spend against them and continue to source and do additional contracts, and having that risk information at hand and visible to everybody in the company is key.
Yeah, I mean, listen, for me for a long time, it was one question, right? Which was, okay, it was simply one question. It was, what percentage of revenue is this supplier receiving from us as a piece of business? And if it's less than 10%, okay, it probably meets our risk criteria, and off to the races we go. And oh, by the way, let's make clear that they actually are a legitimate corporation, and we're not, funding somebody's garage band or something like that, right?
Right.
And then it kind of dove in a little bit more with technology and IT risk, and all of a sudden, the office of the information security officer showed up, and they had a 60-page questionnaire, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess we got to incorporate that, right, Sam? But I mean, that's just a lot more than that than those early days.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if even as little as 5-6 years ago, people really weren't considering third-party management holistically. In fact, you would have maybe your material or critical suppliers if you're a manufacturer, and you were very concerned, with their viability. But beyond that, there was a whole nother section really on the sell side, right? Resellers and distributors,
Right.
And traditionally, they were really vetted for anti-bribery and anti-corruption. And those were two of the primary, categories or types of third parties that were being evaluated.
Yeah.
But as Allison mentioned, the pandemic really, put a spotlight on, more holistic third party management, where now you're starting to see everything from information security, which has been traditional, financial health and viability, but new elements like environmental and social governance, where you've got now diversity and inclusion and sustainability, which traditionally may not have been considered risk, but more compliance is now a big part of how we evaluate third parties as well. And the idea now is to be able to share that information across lines of business, where we had just mentioned these teams used to operate in silos, right? Information security would conduct an assessment and it would be in a black box for a bit. The result of that assessment might be taken into consideration, by the purchasing organizations. But now all of that information across all domains is really being shared with sourcing professionals, with procurement professionals, with ethics and compliance, with legal, with all lines of business. So now we get a holistic view of that third party, and we can determine, if we want to do business with them today, how they're performing. If we choose to do business with them, continue to ongoing monitor them. And then if we do need to terminate, obviously put a process in place for that. So there really has been an evolution, I think, over the last 10 years, going from strictly evaluating material third parties and really anti-bribery, anti-corruption for resellers and distributors, to a more holistic view, and then integrating that data across lines of business. And that's really been kind of that fundamental transition that we've seen. And from Coupa's perspective, we really have originated as a spend management organization, right? Really driving the value of every dollar spent by a company. Right. Well, in order to be able to drive value for every dollar spent, we need to make sure that the organizations we're spending that money on are viable, aren't going to hurt our reputation. So now we've gotten into, the third-party risk management space and kind of combined that. So I think that's Coupa's unique point of view here, but there are certainly lots of other companies providing automation in the space that Coupa takes advantage of, and several others.
Yeah, I think there's a couple key, and there's a lot there. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate both of you just kicking us off and getting us started. Certainly a couple takeaways from me just right out of the gate. One of these things is, and I always thought of third-party risk as, okay, I'm in supply chain, I got to buy green paint or else my combine harvester doesn't go out the door, right? And that's supply chain risk, right? And God, there's plenty of it in that space. Right. But that's not what this is all about. I mean, this is an evolution of that, really, in the supply associated with just day-to-day operations and things like that. Right. I mean, I want to make sure that we focus, at least for this conversation. I understand that there's inherent risk in the supply chain, but I'm talking, and we're focusing primarily on all the other opportunities of risk. And I think, Allison, you told us, and I know we're going to dive into it at some point, that you told me that some organizations are actually, and we'll talk about how people are modeling risk later, but you told me that there's some organizations that have as many as 22 different pools of risk right now, which blows me away. I can't imagine what that algorithm looks like. But then at the same time, Sam, right? I mean, this really is an interesting time, because finally technologies, and even Coupa, the speed at which the technologies are starting to evolve actually allows us for the first time to track a lot of this all in one place and create that holistic approach where we're not working in silos anymore. I can actually now get information from the financial risk management team, which tends to be the finance team, or the IT risk management team, which happen to be technologies, and whether or not some of our suppliers pass the third-party risk assessment. Because let's be honest, most of the technology we're buying is in the cloud now, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why this is all happening so rapidly now, is because the evolution of the technology to actually be able to get your hands on this information.
Yeah, and I think though it's important, Mike, to differentiate and clearly distinguish between third-party risk management and what that means, and supply chain risk management and what that means, right? I kind of definitely draw a specific line between them, where in order to have a resilient supply chain, right? Everyone wants to have resiliency in their supply chain, and the ability to be able to react quickly to one of those suppliers falling out of favor. But in order to have a resilient supply chain, you need to first have an effective third-party management program. So third-party management, again, is going after really the entity level or contract or relationship level risk with certain third parties, right? Are they financially viable? Do they meet my compliance guidelines? Are they information security safe? Do they meet my GDPR regulations for data privacy? Those types of domains. And then once I've determined that that third party is acceptable and meets that criteria, now I can place them into my supply chain. And now my supply chain is really concerned with what goods and services, specifically down to the product level, that the components that that third party is providing, right? So you mentioned, the green paint on the tractor. Right. Well, if I'm making the tractor, I know I need green paint. It's going to come from supplier X. I now do third-party management on supplier X. I allow them in my supply chain. Now my supply chain needs to understand where that green paint is specifically being manufactured down to the location, maybe even how that green paint is put together and who those third-party and fourth parties might be to provide, the resin and the colors that go into the paint. Because if there's some incident at the factory that makes the green paint, how is that going to affect my ability to produce that tractor, the inventory on hand, right? So supply chain really is down to the part level and managing the movement of those parts, where third-party management is, I think, one level up, where it's taking care of the risks associated before I allow that particular supplier or third party into my supply chain. So kind of a clear differentiation there, Allison.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Allison.
I just wanted to drill down a little on one thing you said, which I think is critical for people to think about, which is because a lot of people think of supplier risk, right? And I always use IBM as an example, right? So doing business with IBM, not a risky company, right? They're not going away.
Right.
And if you just buy laptops from IBM, that's probably not a real risky thing, right? You can go get another laptop provider tomorrow if for some reason IBM says we're no longer selling laptops. But if you put all your customer data or sensitive financial data in their data center, right, and they have access to all that, that is a completely different risk profile, where you better do your due diligence on that data center and data privacy, information security, business continuity plan, all that stuff, right? So that's where you might get to those 22 different risk areas, right? Where you need to evaluate IBM for the delivery of that particular service, right? So a lot of the risks are really, what's the supplier's ability to deliver that paint, right? Or deliver that service.
Yep.
And so it's an important distinction that you need to be able to do. And as the big change in the last 10 years too is around regulations, right? So companies in certain industries are now, have to face regulators who demand a more holistic approach, demand that you have consistent documentation and defensible data around, did you do your assessment? Did you do it at all the stages? Did you capture all the information? Are you monitoring the risks? And so forth. So I packed a lot in that little extra answer.
That's all right. That's all right. We're coming out of the gate like a thorough. I love it. It's like the bell rings and I love it. So I'm going to tap the brakes for 1 second. I want to do a poll of the audience. I want to do a poll of the attendees, and I want to do a poll of the people on LinkedIn who are watching this right now. And I want to just get a test. So here's something real quickly. I don't build polls inside of Zoom meetings. I apologize for that. It's much easier for me to just do it this way. So everybody that's in the attendee in the room, or everybody who's on LinkedIn right now, on a scale of 1 to 5, tell me, in your opinion, where you're at in the maturity level associated with your third-party risk management program, right? And by the way, thank you, Allison and Sam, for telling us and making that unique differentiator between supply chain risk and third-party risk. So I appreciate it. So one being, hey, I don't even know how to spell third-party risk. I thought it was two-party risk, not third-party risk. And 5 being, we're bending spoons. We know where everything is. We feel completely confident in our tier 2 and tier 3. And we've got this thing completely buttoned up. We pass internal audit. Our CFO loves us. Everybody's content. The risk management guy buys us, scotch and wine every year at the end of the year. That's a 5, right? Does that sound right? How's that? Is that good? All right. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to see some numbers coming up. Wow, I see 2s, I see 3s. I actually see a 4. Congratulations on the 4. I didn't think 4s were actually there yet. So if you get a 4, congratulations. So while the audience is talking about that, I know you started to, one of my questions, which you already answered, which is what's your definition of supplier risk? And I think you've already handled that for us. So thank you very much. But there's a lot there, right? And you started to, when we did the walkthrough, and this is where my education really started to hit in, the differences between inherent risk and residual risk. So now that we've kind of laid down the groundwork on what is supply chain risk versus third-party risk, can you tell us a little bit about inherent risk versus residual risk? I'll go to Allison first. If you can just kind of extrapolate on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Sure. I think especially for a procurement audience, it's probably good to frame this in a sourcing context, right? So you've all been through sourcing events, you put out an RFP. So I'll give you a use case, right? We're thinking of outsourcing HR benefits, right? So the first thing a lot of our customers will do is say, okay, let's do a risk assessment of that. We don't know which supplier is going to deliver the service, but let's risk assess this. So is the supplier going to have access to our data? Well, yeah, it's employee data, sensitive data. Is this going to be a cloud solution? Probably, right? Is it going to be overseas? So answering a whole bunch of questions. So something like that. So that inherently looks very risky, right? Because whoever the supplier is they're going to have a lot of, access to sensitive information and so forth. So that's really inherent risk. So that's before I've evaluated my supplier or potential suppliers, right? So then that will say, okay, based on all those potential risks, here are the hundreds of questions that I go ask my supplier, potential suppliers, and they give me all the answers, and then all my experts evaluate all the answers. And what's left over is the residual risk, right? So the company A is somebody we're considering. They have great controls in place. They have really rock solid data protection and everything else. So that inherently looked really high risk, but we evaluated the supplier, the leftover or residual risk is much lower, right? And then, so that helps us compare supplier A to supplier B from a sourcing perspective, right? So it's not always, comes in context of a sourcing event or process, but that's really the inherent risk is initially, I evaluate the supplier, what's left over is the residual.
Right.
Make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. Sam, anything to add to that, or are we good there?
Sure. I think, for those a little bit more familiar with the risk space, basically what Allison is saying is a supplier, comes to us with some level of inherent risk, no matter who they are. And ultimately, we want to put some kind of control on them, right? And a control can be something as simple as Allison mentioned, sending them a questionnaire and having them answer questions. We score those questions. And ultimately, based on those responses, we learn a little bit more about them. So then hopefully that inherent risk would come down. So that questionnaire can be a form of control. Other forms of controls can be more rigorous, right? I might have to put them through specific training classes that I want them to go through. That's a form of control. I might have to take a site visit because I want to really make sure that what they're claiming in their questionnaire responses are actually true, right? So I may want to do that for really critical or material suppliers, and that may be a form of control. So there's a lot of different types of controls or different tests that we would put in place to take that inherent risk and reduce it to residual risk. The other thing that Allison has mentioned a few different times here is kind of this ongoing monitoring of the third party over time, because this is fluid, right? Information security might be the easiest one to explain, right? There's a lot of companies like BitSight and Security Scorecard and Risk Recon who are data service providers that do ongoing monitoring from really a non-intrusive perspective. They'll go and scan websites and do all different types of things and come back with a score themselves. And sometimes that score fluctuates. So if I'm monitoring one of those data services and that score drops or goes up, that's going to affect my residual risk. And I might want to take an action on that, right? So this residual risk is something that's fluid. And it's also really important because that's what regulators are going to look at when they audit your firm for your third-party resilience or your third-party program. They're going to look to see how you measure residual risk. They're going to look to see if you've taken appropriate actions to reduce that residual risk over time. And if you haven't, they'll probably make some suggestions. In the financial services space, you might get a matter that requires attention, or an MRA. It's a very financial services specific type of response that needs to be made to a regulator. But if you're not performing these things and you're not conducting a very rigorous approach of inherent to residual risk, chances are you don't have a mature enough third-party program, and you should look into that. So it's really a sense of, how do I take inherent, apply a control or a test, and then recalculate residual.
Right. So a couple of things there. Number one, first, you mentioned something about training there, what I thought was really interesting. And I'm assuming now, based on some other market influences, that you have to be pretty fluid in this. I mean, for example, right now, supplier diversity inclusion is big, right? And we're all trying to find and leverage supplier diversity inclusion in our supplier base, right? But there's risk associated with some of the newer diversity-owned business modeling, because they just don't have some of the years of experience. And what you said was, you could do a site visit or you could push them to training. I never really even thought about that before, which is, geez, if they don't meet that criteria, usually you just walk away and call it a day. It's like an RFP process where, you evaluate somebody for an RFP and they lose, and it's like, okay, see you later. But what you're saying is there's actually an opportunity to help develop and bring them into the fold, and you don't, flush the baby out with the bathwater per se. You can actually start to enhance their process, right?
Yeah, no, Mike, think of it almost from a performance management standpoint, right? Because that's part of third-party management. A component is performance management. So if you look at how you're measuring the performance of a supplier, typically if they underperform, you just don't let them go, right? You want to put an improvement plan in place, right? And typically it's collaborative. How do I get closer to this supplier? Similarly, for new suppliers, especially some of the smaller suppliers that may not have the resources, or minority and women-owned suppliers who are just starting out and might not have the capabilities that some more mature suppliers have, you want to put in a collaborative program to maybe help them raise their information security standards, or how they should comply to GDPR. And I'm not implying that new suppliers or diverse suppliers or inclusive suppliers aren't as capable as more mature suppliers, but you brought that up. Basically, I was trying to draw the parallel to putting in a performance plan and helping your supplier achieve your SLAs or KPIs from a performance standpoint, to also helping underperforming suppliers in terms of risk and compliance to get them to the levels to meet your standards. Because sometimes you really can't do without that supplier. You don't want to replace them, but you do want to reduce the risk of doing business with them. So I kind of look at it as, how do I help them perform? How do I help them improve their compliance capabilities? How do I reduce their risk? And you could put a collaborative plan in place to help them do that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's almost an investment of your time to get them to a certain level where they might actually win more business with other potential clients because of what they're learning through your process, right, Allison?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The other thing I've been thinking about too is the whole mitigation of risk around training is often comes up around bribery and corruption, right? So one of the requirements is, a lot of times you need, so your suppliers, like as a supplier to our customers, we need to attest that we do ongoing privacy, we do ongoing bribery and corruption training of all of our employees, right? We need to attest that to our customers. So a lot of companies need to go out to their suppliers and say, okay, prove to me that, show me your training content, how many of your employees have been trained, all the employees who support the good or service you deliver to us, have they been trained for bribery and corruption? So it's part of that ongoing monitoring and risk mitigation, and even regulatory compliance for a lot of companies, that they have to do that, get that attestation from their suppliers, right? That they're doing that training. So it's not only the delivery of the training, but also getting that attestation from them.
I think it's interesting that you bring up corruption and risk associated with corruption, because one of the things we did talk about in the walkthrough was around the fact that, and this was an aha moment for me, I have to admit it. And I'm happy to admit that I don't know much in 20 years of experience. There's things I learn every day, and thankfully Allison taught me something. This is not all about buy side, right? A lot of this is around sell side and corruption in the sell side. And when you talk about third party risk, and I kind of had this aha moment right in front of Sam and Allison where they're like, oh my God, this guy's light bulb just went off. This is a little scary, right? He used to be a chief procurement officer. For me, I had this moment where I was like, okay, wow, this is as much a buy side risk as it is sell side risk, because you started to talk a little bit about an example of potentially a large technology manufacturing firm that has to be really careful around third party risk in their sales channels, right?
Exactly. So we've seen this in a lot of technology and pharmaceutical, oil and gas, right, where they're going into emerging markets, and a lot of times they are required to use local resources, right, to distribute their products and sell their products. And a lot of those emerging markets, bribery and corruption is a way of life, and most countries have to comply to things like the FCPA Act in the US or UK anti-bribery, and there's others in most major countries, right? And the fines, if they're caught, right, doing bribery and corruption, are huge, absolutely huge. So a lot of these global organizations literally have hundreds of people dedicated to vetting all these local in-country resources that they have to use if they want to distribute their medical devices or their chips or their, their technology, right? So they have to put a lot of time and effort. And again, from our perspective, right, software is one of the key ways to be able to scale, right? So that you can, with the same amount of resources, get to more distribution channels, right? Be able to vet that many more third parties that you want selling your products and so forth. So I think that's generally what we talked about. And I don't know, Sam, you also have a lot of experience in this area too. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think, just again, from a procurement standpoint, when you think of the definition of a third party, it really isn't just buy side. It's really any business relationship you have outside of your employees and clients, right? So those are resellers and distributors. Those are charities, right? It's, again, any organization you have a business relationship with that isn't your client or isn't your employee. That's really the definition of third party, and how and what types of organizations should be encompassed. And from a bribery and corruption standpoint, from a reseller and distributor standpoint, the reason why there was such an emphasis is because the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act and similar regulations in Asia came with real fines. Monetary fines are part of it, but now people are going to jail and for breaking these regulations. So that brings a whole nother level of penalty to breaking these regulations when there's civil suits against you. So now these regulations have teeth, similar to GDPR, has real monetary teeth. And that was really another catalyst for why the third-party management space became more mature, and there was a lot more interest because of these types of penalties. And I don't see them slowing down. In fact, they're going into other areas as well. Reputational damage comes with its own penalty, right? So if you happen to be using a distributor who is bribing a government, it's just like you're bribing the government, and your reputation goes down. Talk about, diversity and inclusion. If we don't take those things into consideration, a lot of the buyers now really look for that. So reputationally, we want to make sure, that we're sensitive to those areas now, because that hurts valuation, it hurts, stock price. So those things are becoming more and more important. So this idea of reputational damage that can be impacted not only by, the regulations that are in place, but also the buying communities now are far more aware of risk and compliance, diversity, inclusion, environmental, social governance than ever before. So it's really important, not just from a buy side, but also from the sell side of our organizations, how we generate revenue, obviously also how we produce our products.
Yeah. So Michael on LinkedIn says reputation is king, right? I mean, you can you can die by reputation
Yeah.
somewhere in your third party risk, and it's got nothing to do with whether or not you had enough green paint or somebody passed the
No.
information security policy. You get one company in a third party that is bribing a local government to potentially sell that you're unaware of, and all of a sudden now your software is associated with, because nobody's going to know about the channel partner, right? Everybody's going to know
That's right.
about the product that's coming down.
Yeah.
It's never the channel partner's name that hits the nightly news, right?
Yeah, I mean,
It's always the manufacturer of the software or the system or whoever that gets drawn.
And we all know it takes years and years and years to build a reputation, and 5 minutes, 5 seconds to lose it, these days.
Well, look at this. It reminds me of the 3 R's of risk, right? Revenue, reputation, and regulatory, right? So that's what most companies really are trying to mitigate. And they're often linked. I mean, look at the Target breach, right? It's taken them years to recover from that and the impact to their stock price. So, and their reputation, right? And it was all through third party, right?
I want to go back on that for a second. Hold on. Revenue, I'm not writing fast enough. Revenue, reputation, and regulatory. I'm sorry. All right. So
3 R's.
I do this thing when we're in these things, and you can see I just put one in the messages here around nuggets. Both of you are throwing nuggets at me too fast right now.
Oh.
So the first one is the 3 R's of risk, third party risk, which is revenue, reputation, and regulatory. If you didn't get that, write it down, tattoo it. If this is your responsibility, put it on your desk and look at it every day. The second one that Sam just said, which I've heard before, but I think you did it very well, which is it takes years to build reputation and strength. It takes 5 minutes to lose it all, right? And that's really what you're trying to protect when you're doing this. So a couple quick questions that have come up already kind of in the blend as we were talking. One of them, Amit says, what are some examples of metrics that could be set up for high to medium and low risk suppliers? We're going to talk a little bit about KPIs and metrics, I think, a little bit further down the road. So I'm going to put a pin in that for a minute until we get to the next section. Julia actually asked a question and says, and I'm just going to read it verbatim inside of the room. Says, so in terms of initial definitions of TPRM versus supply chain risk that Sam spoke to, do you see managing DEI, social, sustainable risk fitting better into the former or the latter?
Third party. Those are third party risks versus supply chain.
Okay,
so
great.
all of those are the front end domains that I would consider before I would even let a third party into my supply chain. Right? So they have to qualify to get into my supply chain. Right. And that's kind of the way you can look at third party risk management relative to supply chain. Third party risk management is your qualification. Nobody even gets into my supply chain before they pass my third party program. Right. Yeah. If they get through that, now I can put them into my supply chain and then start to measure that movement of product and the actual goods or services that third party provides me to make my products. Right. Supply chain is more around the movement and association of the good or service with the particular third party. Third party is really about the qualifications like DEI, social, sustainability. All that comes first. Once we pass those tests, now I can put them into my supply chain.
Allison, any thoughts?
Lots. I think then, that can come back to the convergence of spend management and risk management, right? Because in spend management, right, you see a lot of companies need that kind of visibility and to try and drive more of their spend to diverse suppliers, right? So as they're looking to source or do supplier discovery, so having access to those types of that type of attribute information, if you will, demographics, this visibility into that, and then the ability to, of course, assess them for, again, the good or service that you are specifically looking for, right? Because again, another company over here may be looking for a different good or service from that same supplier. So the risk that you're willing to take on is relative to what you want from them, right? So, did we lose Mike?
Oh, Mike, did we lose you?
I think we did. He will be glad to. He'll come right back on. If there's any other tidbits you want to share or any more nuggets, like he mentioned, that would be great. And he'll just log right back on. It's no problem at all. We're still live.
So but I just have one more, another use case, interesting use case that came up a few years ago, working with a company that provides vet medicine, right? They had, and we were collaborating with them around assessing risk of some of their key supply chain suppliers. And they said, listen, there are some that we have to go to some of these little, places that they have specific rabbits that they grow to, that create a specific serum that we use in a vaccine. Like there's only one, right? So there you go. You have to do business with them. But so then it becomes the key is to putting in those mitigating measures, right, and controls to make sure that they stay in business, whether it's the ongoing education, it's the constant collaboration and validation that they're still doing okay, and best you can to put in any kind of mitigation process or business continuity processes. So if for some reason they do go out of business, okay, either we can't make that product for a while, or is there anything else we can do behind the scenes? So there are those use cases out there.
Sam, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah.
I think I'm back. I'm sorry about that.
All right.
I'm going to come in live on my phone because it looks like I've lost all internet access in my house. A first, of course, of all time, which
Oh no.
Oh my
I
goodness.
said would never happen. And now, of course, it happens with all of you.
Well,
So I'm
Mike,
gonna-
did you do a good job of vetting your internet provider for, their business continuity plan? Because clearly, something's not good there. When
No,
you're
but he did a great job training me what to do if this happens, right? It was flawless, like
There
nothing
you go.
happened. We were like, wait, there's no mic? That's okay, we'll keep talking.
Mitigating risk.
Yes. Okay. So I apologize. I'm back. It looks like we're still live and everybody's going. It was just me, right?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. So I just want to just 1 second. I apologize. We still have 18 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. So we were. What happened while I was gone? What did we talk about while I was gone?
We were really just kind of wrapping up that conversation,
Great.
around supply chain and third-party management. I think the question came in from, I want to say her name was Julie. So we were just wrapping up that conversation.
Cool.
And concluding that question.
So shockingly enough, we're already about 40 minutes into this conversation, which I knew this would happen. I think we could probably do 3 hours on this, broken up over time with the three of us, because it's absolutely riveting. I love this topic. Probably why we designed an entire conference about it in August. I want to talk a little bit more in transition now into a little bit about building a better mousetrap, or what's happening out there. What can people do? The first thing I want to talk about is the people in the process, right? So we talk a lot about the people inside of procurement and sourcing right now inside of those organizations, and the fact that they need to have spend analytics skill sets and they need to have proper negotiation skill sets. Any insights from you two on risk mitigation or risk strategy associated with skill sets? Because it certainly isn't something that's on a lot of people's radar right now. So can we talk a little bit about if we're trying to build this better and we're trying to get better at this and continuous improvement inside of our organizations, what type of skills do people need to be bringing to the table right now, in your opinion? Sam, why don't you jump in? I apologize.
So there's a framework might be a strong word, but there's a concept in, from a risk professional. And I think before you identify skill sets, you kind of come up with how you want, to approach, your overall program. And it's typically referred to as kind of 3 lines of defense. And the first line of defense is really your line of business, right? And so you're trying to think, what skills does your line of business need? Well, in reality, they don't need risk skills. Right. They just need to be able to answer some fundamental questions, because you want them involved. You want them to start to take some accountability in the choices that they're making for the third parties that they choose. Right. So a lot of the capabilities that a software program will provide, it's called an inherent risk questionnaire. It's typically sent out to that line of business to make them answer some fundamental questions. And it's not so much that they need a specific skill set. It's that the company itself wants to incorporate risk into its culture. And to do that, you need everybody involved, everybody. So similarly, how really strong spend management software is going to create an easy user interface so everyone requisitions out of that software or uses its expense reporting system. We want to have that same opportunity for everybody to take place in managing a company's risk, including the individual line of business down to the end user. So that's step one. Where the real skill set comes into place is for that second line of defense. And that's typically where you have the subject matter experts, right? So you're going to have information security experts, typically underneath the CISO. The Chief Information Security Officer will typically manage those resources responsible for information security and information privacy, as an example, right? So you really want to build up that strength. And I know a lot of universities now are actually teaching third-party risk management. They're teaching supply chain management. So over the last 5, 6, 7 years, very prominent, right? So you can actually go to universities and hire, coming right out of college, people with the fundamentals around supply chain, third-party risk, information security, information privacy kind of capabilities. Typically people in finance have it, right? So you're looking for, financial viability experts, people who can manage risk in that space. That's a major category. And it's really, like I said, that second tier of subject matter experts where you're looking for specific skill sets. And then finally, that third level of defense is going to be internal audit. And they're not necessarily risk experts like your SMEs are, but they know how to audit a process and find gaps in that process. So it's really important to include them and not be afraid of internal audit. Internal audit isn't someone to be afraid of. It's someone who you want to collaborate with and include them because they'll find a gap and then you can then fix it. So rather than focus on individual skill sets, because I'm not an educator, I'm not part of an advisory services firm, you look at kind of that framework and think of these three sets of organizations or three lines of defense. And to me, that's what's important, where the SMEs are really your uniquely skilled individuals within each domain that you would go and hire to and really gauge that level of expertise. So hopefully that kind of gives people a starting point.
Allison?
Yeah, I think that's really speaks to one of the challenges in third-party risk management, as Sam talked about. It's just there's so many stakeholders involved in the process, right? Because you're not going to have one person who's going to be able to evaluate all the risks, right? Because the line of business knows what they want, right? What they want from the third party from a business perspective and the results that they want. You got the subject matter experts, right? That need to do the detailed evaluation and read that SOC audit report or analyze their business continuity details and so forth. Your financial viability is even different stakeholders. Then you have management that wants to look at, okay, what's our overall risk profile across, different categories of suppliers and third parties and so forth. And then you have legal. So that's really one of the biggest challenges, are all these different stakeholders that are involved, right? And, we've seen companies struggle with that collaboration, right? They're doing it in spreadsheets because they have that skill set, right? And then they have all these SharePoint drives and all these spreadsheets and so forth. And then, if they are subject to regulation, regulators come in and go, what? How can you quantify, report on risk, with all this stuff in spreadsheets on a shared drive, right? So I think being able to collaborate, right, that between all those internal stakeholders as well as the third party themselves, to get that level of efficiency and consistency so that you can deal with more than just your top 5 critical suppliers, right? So you can start to evaluate more and more is a critical part.
I think that's true of everything. I think the practice as a whole, the craft of procurement and sourcing as a whole is it's not siloed anymore. If you're doing it in a silo, you're doing it the wrong way. It really is a collaborative effort. You're not just the guy or a woman who plays trumpet or violin anymore. You're part of an orchestra now that's trying to play a piece of music. And I think for a long time we thought about ourselves as single contributors, but more and more, and in some, for good and for bad, things like global pandemics and things like that, we're really starting to be shown that, hey, listen, this is a ongoing collaborative effort across our peers. By the way, 10 minutes left. We have a ton still to cover. I want to jump in. I want to talk about KPIs. I want to talk about the 22 different risk pools. And I want to talk about modeling risk and the cost of modeling risk. And at what point does this all become something that it's worth it or not? Like, how do you calculate the value of risk modeling, management, and things like that? So let's jump right in. Allison, tell us a little bit about your example of 22 different pools of risk. I mean, it was shocking to me to hear this list. I'd love to write them all down and throw them into the Procurement Foundry and see if we can get even more. But extrapolate on that a little bit, please.
So this is a customer is a bank I've been working with for about 11 years. So they didn't start off with 22 different risk areas that they evaluated, but they're up to potentially 22, right? So not every supplier or third party that they analyze will be subject to 22 different areas of risk evaluation.
Yeah.
Right. But they're up to 22 accounting. So, and I think, there's multiple aspects to that, because let's just take one, for example, like, information security, right? It's almost everybody has that risk area that they need to look at for, certain part of their third party base. So, being able to quantify, right, the data that you get from the suppliers to get a relative risk rating is tremendously helpful, right? So you ask of 10 different IT suppliers, you ask the same 1,000 questions, you get answers. System tells you, okay, this one scored a 90%, this one scored only a 50, this one scored a 60 and an 80, right? So your subject matter experts need to interpret, okay, of that, what areas do we want to mitigate? Is that too much risk? Is that not enough risk in the line of business? And all that collaboration that we talked about all gets backed into it. But I think companies are constantly evolving the risk areas that they look at, how they weight those in an overall kind of risk scorecard. And, so from our perspective, having the flexibility to continually update that and configure that as new regulations come out, as companies evolve their risk practices from a 1 to a 2 to a 3 to a 5, right, is critical.
Yeah, Sam, anything on, and thank you for that, Allison. I know, like I was only able to name like 4 or 5, and you said there were 22, and I'm like, okay, after cyber risk and financial risk and social, geopolitical or corporate social responsibility risk, and the 5 that are underneath that umbrella, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I get a lot to add to my list. Sam, any thoughts on that? And also, can you tell me a little bit about the KPI thing? So one of the questions that came up earlier, and I don't have access to the comments right now, but I know earlier in the Q&A there was a question around KPI and metrics associated with this. Can you give me a little bit on KPIs and metrics that good organizations that you're seeing right now? What are they measuring against? What are they deploying as far as KPIs for success? And ultimately, I'll ask both of you that at the end is, what does success look like?
Yeah. So two things to consider, right? One was, we talked about all these domains, right? 22, 35. There's essentially as many domains as a company really wants to measure. I mean, different industries certainly have different priorities, right? If I'm a manufacturer, versus a financial services company, certain domains will be in play and certain other domains won't. We also talked a lot about the sheer number of third parties, right? So in order to be able to process, the amount of information, you do need automation. And an important part of that automation is a capability called segmentation, right? And what we do with that is there's fundamental business rules that a company will have that will determine what domains are in scope for what type of third party and the good or service that they are providing, right? So It's very important to have strong automation and strong segmentation. Otherwise, you can't reach scalability to measure the next phase, which would be your KPIs, right? What's really important, when I do that, right? So KPIs and SLAs are typically referred to in performance management. From a risk scoring standpoint, it's usually called a risk matrix, right? Where I've got all my domains on one dimension, and then the way I'm going to score them on the other dimension of the axis, right? And each one of those domains is typically going to have a different scoring methodology that you would rely on your subject matter experts to help you come up with. So unfortunately, there's not one answer. There's not one answer to say, hey, here's how you score, information security, and this is the finite way you do it. And here's how you would score financial viability. It really gets down to the risk tolerance of each organization, because certain organizations have higher risk tolerances and will score things differently. But ultimately, you do want to get things down to as much of a quantitative measurement as possible. You're trying to get away from qualitative measurements. You want to take human error and human opinion out of these decisions, right? So the more quantitative you can make it, the more robust your program will be, and the easier it will be able to stand up to an auditor, right? Because when you remove human opinion, now you've got more of a mathematical formula around how you're making decisions. And that person who might have made the decision, who's no longer with your company, you can't track them down and find the logic that they used inside their head, right? So you want things to be more quantitative than qualitative at all times, which is why they come up with what is called a scoring matrix or a risk matrix. And then that scoring methodology typically breaks down into a 0 to 100 scale. And then somewhere in that scale, to make it easy for that first line of defense, the end users, that'll be a high, medium, or low risk sometimes, or the red, yellow, green kind of stoplight metaphor, that gets used. But unfortunately, I can't, in 5 minutes give you, how to, calculate these risk matrices and examples. Given more time, I'd love to provide some templates on how to do that in different areas and different domains. But essentially, that's the philosophy behind scoring risk: quantitative versus qualitative, typically on a 0 to 100 scale, breaking these things down by domain.
I think we just found the topic for our next meetup, which is designing risk models and how to build out yours. I see it basically as every different company has its own culture, has its own DNA footprint. Even within industries, right? One banking is different because their primary business is in Europe versus the US, right? I mean, everybody's got a different blend associated with, might be a big company in the US that's trying to break into Europe, as opposed to a company that's been in Europe for a long time and trying to break in the United States. Obviously, banking is completely different than manufacturing or consumer packaged goods or financial services or marketing and advertising, or all of those different things. So thank you for attempting to unravel a very complicated question that doesn't just have one answer. I really appreciate that. Shockingly, we're out of time. We're at the end of this, and I definitely would love to. We're gonna have to talk to the powers that be about having you back in. I love the idea of coming back probably after the August 5th conference and having a conversation around deep dives into risk models and things like that with you. I would love to have you back to talk about that again. And maybe we might be able to do that on like a Clubhouse event or something like that, because we do have a couple thousand people that follow us on Clubhouse as well. I can drive you two into Clubhouse and we can continue the conversation there at some point in time as well in the future. So we could do something like that. I want to try and end now with what is, if there's one thing that everybody needs to take away from all of this, Allison, and I'll start with you, ladies first. And there's a lot, right? I mean, I have like 8 or 9 nuggets listed now. What is one thing that people should be taking away with them as they think about this, in addition to, oh my God, how do I get in touch with Allison and Sam? What's the other thing they should be thinking about?
Wow. I'd say ultimately what companies should be looking for is to drive a risk-aware culture, right? So in everything that they do, especially, from a spend management perspective, but even on the distribution and sales side, right? So risk becoming part of all aspects of how they do business. And the only way to do that is to be able to effectively and efficiently evaluate and track those risks, right? And quantify those. So, and truly the only really way to do it is with software, right? Is to get that automation.
Exactly.
And to pull in all the stakeholders and then make all that data visible. So, I mean, we can get into more KPIs and things to drive that, but I guess this would be Sam.
Yeah. Sam, your thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, really just to compliment what Allison is saying, it's this notion of the convergence of spend management and risk management is happening. It's evolving every day. And I would encourage the procurement professionals to be curious, go talk, to your subject matter experts in different areas. You might be surprised because guess what? You're their client, right? Procurement in this case is really their client and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
So you want to work together for the betterment of the organization. And I think historically that really wasn't done. I know plenty of CPOs and they don't even know who the CISO in their company is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a mistake. They should, for instance, on information security, or you might understand, from the financial analyst point of view, why they're looking at credit ratings, which is really a historical perspective of a company. You really want to look at forward leading indicators, not historical indicators. So, go and be curious, talk to your colleagues. I think that's a big first step into kind of breaking down the traditional walls between lines of business, which ultimately will lead to a really successful program that's collaborative in nature.
Congratulations, Sam. The first person to ever give me a solid working example of when procurement and sourcing is the client. Every
That's
other
right.
time in my known universe, we are always a service provider and we talk about our stakeholders as clients and all the different departments as clients. This is a really good example, and thank you for that. It's a great thing to end on, which is, hey, you are the client in this example. Go out there, be curious, find out what's available to you for services from the service providers, both internally as well as externally. You're not going to do this without software. It's kind of like, doing abstract math without Excel. You can do it with 1,000 abacus, but you'll be there for a long time. This is not one of those things. You're going to need the software to be able to build these programs. Thank you to Allison very much for talking about building an awareness culture, risk awareness culture. I think that's brilliant. Thank you to both of you for your time today. I look forward to getting in and chopping it up with you again sometime soon, and seeing you at the conference as well. Thanks to Coupa for your continued support of the Procurement Foundry and the fact that you're permanent residents, always bringing amazing content and knowledge to our community. So thank you for that. And by the way, everybody knows you can get in touch with Coupa through their channel inside of the Procurement Foundry. We'll be tagging everyone here inside of the LinkedIn feed. Thank you to everybody that was on LinkedIn today. Thank you to everybody who came and sat in. I apologize for my technical glitch. But other than that, great content, amazing. Definitely got me thinking, and I learned even more today than our first walkthrough. So thank you very much to both of you. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Pleasure.
All right.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Definitely rewind and watch this from the beginning. Amazing content. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.